You're listening to The David Knight Show.
Welcome back. We've had massive swings this week. I mean, we had Monday, I guess it was, people were calling it the Mnuchin Massacre, blaming Steve Mnuchin for the panic that appeared to happen on Monday before Christmas. Then market is closed for Christmas. And then yesterday, we had a massive historic rise. We had the highest single-day point increase ever, 1,000 points up. It's the highest percentage raise in nearly a decade. So things are going back and forth. Let's get Gerald Celente on to make some sense out of this and to talk about where this is all headed. Of course, Gerald Celente, you can find him at trendsresearch.com. That's where you can subscribe to Trends Journal. I think you can get a free sample of it there. That's the monthly journal report that Gerald puts out talking about geopolitical and economic trends. You can also find him on Twitter at Gerald Celente. Joining us now is Gerald Celente. Thank you for joining us, Gerald.
Oh, it's always great being on with you. Thank you. And thank you for all that InfoWars does to enlighten people and give them real news at a time when all this junk news is coming out.
Well, I tell you what, we have, thank you, and thank you for coming on. We've had, I don't know, what kind of a junk market is this? I mean, it's just going all over the place. Is this algorithms that are trading? I've seen some reports, people saying this is the, Wells Fargo is saying it was a giant rebalancing for the pension funds out of bonds and into stocks, a $64 billion buy order that all hit at once, but also the algorithms all being triggered on this. I mean, what is going on with the stock market?
Well, we called an economic 9/11 on September 19th in the trend alert we sent to all our subscribers. And this is 2 days before the S&P reached its peak. It's all about interest rates. And we've been saying that now for the better part of the year. Mm-hmm. All this talk about trade wars is nonsense. It's just mainstream media BS. Because here are the facts, David. All of Trump's tariffs, and I've said this on your show before, have amounted to the grand total of 0.7% negative on China's total GDP. No effect at all. Mm-hmm. It's monetary methadone that has boosted the market since the panic of '08. And I make it very clear, I would have thought we've gone into a depression by 2012. I didn't know anything about zero interest rate policy. I didn't know about quantitative easing or negative interest rate policy as they still have in Japan and Europe. So now with the Fed bringing rates up, the markets can't take it, neither can the real estate market. Look what's going on in the United States. You're seeing home sales going down, particularly on the West Coast, places like Seattle, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Las Vegas, Denver. You're seeing more and more homes go onto the market. They used to say there was a lack of supply. Well, that's building again now. You're looking at new mortgage applications. You're looking at refinancing, way down. They can't take a lousy 5% 30-year mortgage because people aren't making any money. So the only thing that's going to keep this up, and we've been saying it, is if the Fed either does not raise interest rates again in 2019 and or they begin to lower them.
Yeah, we've seen just yesterday, I was talking about the homeless people in L.A., people who are working very successful shows there out of Los Angeles, having to live in their homes. And that's jumped from a couple of years ago from 600 people living out of their cars or their vans up to over 15,700 people in L.A. alone. I mean, you talk about a housing crunch. I mean, they're going to be having a vehicle crunch pretty soon because they're not going to even be able to afford to live out of their cars when we look at this. But you've been saying this consistently, that it's about the interest rates. I said yesterday when they were hammering President Trump for the Christmas Eve call they took from that young kid, and he said, I don't know, you still believe in Santa Claus? At your age, it's kind of marginal. I would say after what we've seen 10 years ago, does anybody still believe in the Fed and quantitative easing? Because after that experience, I think it's kind of marginal, don't you?
The Fed is a criminal organization.
Yeah.
They have no right being here. And that's the dirty word that they use. The Fed. As you well know, there is Fed as Federal Express.
That's right.
They're private bankers that have taken over the country. Again, this is the Christmas season. Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, the only time he gets violent is when he picks up a whip to drive the money changers out of the temple. Merry Christmas. We got a new brand of money changers. You call them the Goldman Sachs gang, the Merrill Lynch mob, one after another. This is a criminal operation. It's against what the Constitution is. It clearly states that Congress only has the right, and they've turned it over. A low-life piece of crazy garbage that the Democrats still hail. Woodrow, may he rot in hell, Wilson, who brought us to World War I that we should have never gotten into, that just went on to destroy Europe even more and kill so many of our soldiers. And he gave us the Federal Reserve, a Princeton boy, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, bullets, bombs, and banks. The story hasn't changed.
That's right. Absolutely. And, as you pointed out, Jesus took whips to the money changers. We had President Trump give them a tongue lashing this last week. And then immediately you had his Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, come in and say, oh, no, he can't fire the Fed. President Trump is saying this is absolutely crazy. Earlier in the week, I had read some articles from people saying if they raise interest rates again, it is malpractice and they all ought to be fired. And then they did it. And then President Trump said, I think this guy ought to be fired. They all ought to go. But you could certainly start with that. And certainly he has the authority to fire him based on the Federal Reserve Act. It's for cause. You don't have to have misconduct in terms of creating a criminal act. It's just the fact of what they've done to sabotage this economy. That's supposed to be their mission, to make our economy grow. And yet it's the Fed, Gerald, when we've got the president of China bragging about how they've been allowed to have 10% a year growth for the last 40 years. The Fed will burn down our economy if we get above 2 or 3% growth rate.
Again, they're making up this 2%. We heard that from Paul Volcker, who was the former Fed chair under the Reagan administration. They just made up this number. They make up everything. So there's no basis for it. But again, we have to look at the reality. We would not be in this problem if the natural fundamental economics would have taken place after the crash, rather than bailing out the too big to fails, the big corporations, and artificially boosting the stock markets. Because here's the deal. The reason why consumers, and by the way, we just saw high retail spending, 6-year high, coming out of the retail sector for Christmas this year, is that the money the average person isn't concerned about the stock market because 10% of our population owns 90% of the stocks on average of about $350 million, $350 million per percent of that 90%. So each household that has it in that 10% that owns the 90, the rest of the 10% that's left by the entire country, the average is only $15,000. And that includes pension programs. So the average person isn't concerned about the equity markets because, again, this is a fact, 95% of the jobs that were created since the Obama administration brought all this in are temporary jobs, what they proudly call a gig economy.
Yeah. And, of course, General Motors is, as they shut down factories here in America, they're opening up more factories in Mexico because they can pay the workers there 1/10 of what they pay the workers here. They pay them $3 an hour instead of $30 an hour. And what you're talking about in terms of stock market, that's just another metric that shows that the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few individuals. But it is going to blow back. We want to talk to you when we come back about what you see coming in the new year. What the big trend's going to be, what's going to happen economically, and then we'll talk a little bit about geopolitics as well. But I want to get your economic projections coming across because you've been right. This is really about interest rates, and they've signaled their intention to continue to raise interest rates. We'll be right back with Gerald Celente. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking to Gerald Celente. Again, you can find him at trendsresearch.com. It's where you can subscribe to Trends Journal, the excellent publication that Gerald puts out. You can find him on Twitter at Gerald Celente. Gerald, let's talk a little bit about what's coming up because we've seen that you've correctly pointed out that the real indicator, they keep talking about the tariffs because they like to blame Trump, and they say, well, he's trying to equalize things in tariffs between the U.S. and China. That can't be allowed. They could lower theirs from 25 to 2.5%. They said, no, we'll only go down to 15%. So Trump said, fine, I'll take mine up to 25. And they go, trade war, this is crazy. It's going to melt down the economy. As you pointed out, it isn't going to make any difference, but the interest rates will. And the Fed began raising interest rates right after President Trump was elected that December. After he was elected in November, they raised interest rates, and they've been raising them 0.25% every single quarter. We've seen this pattern before, and the Greenspan create a bubble, burst the bubble with consistent interest rates, and they've indicated that they're going to continue to do this. What do you see happening then in this next year, assuming that President Trump is, and I think, I want to get your comments on the Fed as well, trying to have this fight to fire Powell. Clearly, I think that's within his prerogative to do that. But I think the real problem is the Federal Reserve as an institution. Putting somebody else in that chair isn't really going to do anything. You really ought to come after that institution by auditing them. And I think there would be a massive move in the American public if they saw what these people are doing after a audit of the Fed to get rid of them entirely. But your comments, first of all, on the interest rates, and we'll talk about the Fed in general.
Well, the Fed and the interest rates, I mean, they've taken on, since the panic of '08, they had a deficit of what, about 800 billion. Now it's what, 4.5 trillion in fake money and bonds that they bought up to juice the economy. And we were talking about General Motors when we took a break. Remember, Obama gave General Motors all that money, our money, to bail out a company that's failing. And as you point out, now they're sending the jobs overseas. And again, people say it's a breakdown of capitalism and they blame socialism. It's not. It's fascism. It's the merger of state and corporate powers by definition. There's no such thing as too big to fail in capitalism. So they've sold us out. And again, we have to look at the ramifications of what's going on globally. So let's take a trip to Europe. Last year, they were bragging about how the European economy was going to zoom ahead. And now we're looking at countries like Germany, which is what, the third largest exporter of product in the world. They're looking at maybe a 1% GDP raise next year. And this is despite negative interest rates. And the ECB, the European Central Bank, may not raise interest rates until the summer of next year. Then we take a look at Japan. Negative interest rates. The Bank of Japan's holding on to $5 trillion worth of debt. That's bigger than Japan's GDP. And negative interest rates, 10-year negative bond yields. So in other words, you buy a bond, 10 years when you cash it in, you get less money than you paid for it. But nobody's buying them. The government's buying them to artificially up Then we take a trip to China, and it's the same thing. China has a debt to GDP ratio of about almost 300. In the 1970s, America's debt to GDP was around 25%. Now it's around 80. So China's way off the charts. Their economy's slowing down. Retail sales just had the worst in 15 years. Auto sales are the biggest plummet since the 1990s. It has nothing to do with trade wars. It has to do with people not having money.
That's right. They weren't buying American cars. The American cars didn't get more expensive for them. And they weren't, actually, that's one thing that didn't really sell much of in the U.S. is Chinese cars, for example.
Yeah, but again, look at the deal. Again, the United States and Europe sold out our country.
That's
you
right.
Want to get your cars made over here in China? Great. Bring over all your manufacturing because we don't know how to do it. But here's the deal. You got to go in partnership with one of our buddies over here in a state enterprise operation, an SEO, and we'll call it a phony name. We'll make it up like a company. Oh, and by the way, you only could be a minority owner in it. They did this with every industry. You go back to the day when Apple used to, I know this is going to come as a shock, they used to make their computers over here. I mean, that's wild. Whoa. But we're going to get rid of those dirty jobs. Now we lost 3.5 million of them to China. Going back to the global economy, the only thing that will keep this artificial economy going is cheap money. They didn't let it happen when the markets crashed. They should not have artificially boosted it. It should have fell, but instead they made the too big to fails bigger. The more merger and acquisition activity almost at a record rate this year until December happened. Stock buybacks, that's where the Trump money went. The facts are there, almost $1 trillion worth of stock buybacks. It didn't go into capital improvements, very small percentage of it. So the only way I see this economy gaining any real permanent strength is what I call a self-sustaining economy. Why are we buying our shoes, our shirts, our socks, and 96% of everything that we wear from foreign countries when we used to have the mills over here, the
That's
people working them? I'm a kid when I grew up in a city, the garment district in New York. The guys would be pushing these things, up and down the streets, racks full of clothes. People had living wages. So it goes back to the housing decline. People can't afford to buy them. And you're talking about the people living in cars. Look what they did in New York over here. Our low-life governor gave the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, a $3 billion tax break to build, Amazon because he could be near Wall Street and the other one's near the Pentagon. So
that's right. When we go back and we look at history, Gerald, looking back at the early days of America, you had Thomas Jefferson saying, we got rid of all internal taxation. They funded a constitutionally sized government strictly on tariffs. He said, what farmer, what laborer, what mechanic know a taxman? Nobody knows a taxman because we got rid of useless things that were being done and downsized the government to fit inside the Constitution. But it wasn't until the early 20th century, around 1913, that we got the Federal Reserve, we got the income tax, and all these bankers who gave us all that stuff said, tell you what we're going to do. We're going to restructure the tax system so that instead of saying nobody in America knows a tax man, instead of making America a tax-free zone, we're going to tax Americans internally, but we won't tax people who sell stuff into our economy. They completely flipped the script at that point, and they keep telling us that's a good thing for us, but it's not a good thing for us. That has eviscerated America's wealth. It has moved our wealth to other countries, to China and elsewhere. That, I think, is really the thing that needs to be undone. We need to go back and go back to our roots and put America first and let Americans, as you point out, be free to produce inside America without having that kind of taxation.
Look at how the liberals love to talk about buy local. Oh, it's wonderful. Mm-hmm. How about buy national?
Yeah, exactly.
Again,
that's a crime. That's fascist, right? They say. And right. Exactly the opposite. What you point out, the real fascism is what we got. Let's talk a little bit. We've just got a couple of minutes left. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other things. Let's talk about gold, for example. I just saw this article about the Russian Central Bank buying a record amount of gold this year after having a record amount of gold that they were buying last year. The interesting thing they said that they're doing is that their bank will make loans to their mining companies. So they're actually buying up and storing the gold that they're mining inside of Russia. But they're pulling in so much gold that they can't source enough of it in 2018, which I think is what's behind them trying to move into Venezuela and doing the same thing there, trying to expand into gold mines in Venezuela. They're very bullish on gold. How do you feel about gold?
Well, again, I've been saying on your show for the better part of a year that we had forecast the bottom of gold being at $1,200 an ounce, simply because that's about what it costs to pull out of the ground. It hit $11.85. We were $15 off. And now as we're speaking, it's above $12.70. Our forecast has not changed over the last 5 years. Gold has to hit $1,450 an ounce before it breaks into a spike, which we believe will go into the 2000s. The whole world is artificially pumped up, and Russia's doing the smart thing by buying more gold, as many countries are, because again, it goes back to these artificial, this digital money backed by nothing and printed on nothing. Mm-hmm. So gold is the ultimate safe haven as we see it.
Yeah, and of course you're pointing out, you've got all these different countries, China, Japan, all these countries awash in debt. I think that France is probably the best example of this. They were saying, oh, look at Italy. We got to attack Italy because they're populous and so forth. And yet this French, the French that are being run by this former Rothschild banker are now in worse economic shape than Italy. And the people there are angry. The people in Italy are happy with their government. The people in France are not happy with what's happening. I think that's maybe the harbinger for what's coming next year. We're out of time, though. Thank you for joining us. Gerald Celente, again, you can find him trendsresearch.com. Great publication, Trends Journal. You can also find Gerald on Twitter at Gerald Celente.
You're listening to The David Knight Show.
We need to go back and revisit the foundations of our freedom. Our freedoms don't consist of the things that are enumerated on a piece of paper. It consists of the things that we're willing to fight for. The First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, the rest of the Bill of Rights are prohibitions. They're prohibitions against powerful organizations and individuals taking those God-given rights from us as individuals. You better understand that, because they're taking them right now. We have seen what they want to do. They called it UN Agenda 21. Now they call it the UN 2030 Agenda. They want everybody off of the rural lands. They want people out of the suburbs. They want to pack everybody into the cities, because that's where it is easiest for them to control everyone.
Never missed your show any day. I mean,